Hi, welcome to our seminar, Intoxication, Addiction, and Art. I'm Lindsay Andrews. I'll be the instructor for this class, but of course, I anticipate that I will learn as much from you as you do from me. I prepared this lecture here in advance of our first class because I'm hoping that when we meet together, we'll just dive right into the readings. But there's a lot of contextual information and historical information that I want to share with you to make sure that we're all on the same page when we do meet together. So my goal here in this video is simply to go over the main terms of the course title. What is intoxication? What is addiction? What is art? And then from there, I want to get us started thinking about their relationships to one another. So with that in mind, I'll just begin with the question, what is intoxication? Intoxication, of course, you can look up the definition for yourself, but I'll just share the one I'm using. Intoxication can be defined as poisoning, as in by a toxin, usually a chemical substance, alcohol or drugs, but it can also be understood as a kind of enthusiasm or frenzy, being bewitched, as being intoxicated by love, for example. In ancient Greece and Rome, these meanings were intertwined. To be intoxicated, as in a Dionysian celebration or a bacchanal, was to be closer to the gods. And there were, of course, even then, good and bad kinds of intoxication. As Plato points out, the pharmakon, which is to say the drug or intoxicating substance, can act as either a poison or a cure. By the early modern period in Europe, the question of the pharmakon, that is, the substance which intoxicates, came increasingly under the auspices of medicine, and the distinction between good and bad forms of intoxication became understood as the distinction between, on the one hand, the art of intoxication, that is, being intoxicated in an appropriate way, in a socially meaningful way, in a creative way, right? Participating in drinking games, engaging in drinking songs, things that were forms of social life and social activity. That's right, the one hand of intoxication, and on the art of intoxication, rather. And on the other, you might fail to master the art of intoxication, which is to say, you might be mastered by the intoxicant. You might be in the throes of the intoxicant. You might be addicted. Importantly, as global travel and trade routes expanded and colonization began to take hold, Europeans brought back new types of intoxicants. In addition to beer and wine, distilled spirits developed indigenously in Europe, so they made their own distilled spirits, and caffeine, tobacco, and coca, what would become cocaine, and opium entered into circulation in Europe. And as the idea of science took hold, science did not sort of pre-exist, right? Sciences became developed throughout this period. Medicine began to transition away from being an art, which historically meant skills that were learned or acquired rather than natural talents. And the physicians who were transitioning medicine from an art to a science were fueled by and studied these new forms of intoxication. William Harvey was one of the first doctors to work experimentally, and that is to say, in a way that we would understand as scientifically. He showed how the blood circulated, and he had daily habits of both caffeine and opium. And these habits fueled his work. That is to say, he used the art of intoxication to master the art of medicine and help to bring it into the realm of the sciences, which ultimately would sort of solidify its it has a kind of professional expertise, right? During this period of rapid changes in global exchange, intoxicants came increasingly to be managed by governmental apparatuses. And these governmental apparatuses were often guided by the knowledge of physicians. These physicians were enlisted to determine what kinds of intoxication were socially good or socially bad. And these were mostly dictated by what was good for the economy. What kinds of intoxicants made one more or less productive? What made one need to be managed by the state or become a ward of the state? And how could we fin that off, right? This is where the contemporary idea of addiction emerges. So, next question, right? What is addiction? Addiction comes from the Latin root addicto, which is to assign or adhere, to stick to. It denoted a kind of devotion above all else, being so devoted to something that you ignored everything else. Nothing else mattered but the thing to which you were devoted. Through the early modern period, this came to designate someone who failed at the art of intoxication, right, the socially acceptable form, someone who was not properly devoted to king and country, which is of course code for colonialism and economic growth, but instead was devoted to the intoxicating substance, the pharmacon. The effects and processes by which intoxicants worked was studied in various scientific ways throughout the 19th century, but it wasn't until the 20th century, which is to say relatively recently, that addiction was studied empirically. And it was the US that pioneered this kind of study. But like the study of intoxication and intoxicants, this interest in addictive substances and addiction was not motivated by some kind of noble therapeutic goal, of course. It was motivated by economics and national interests. Beginning with the indictment of opium dens that presaged the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the history of drug legislation in the US has primarily served through practices of racialization, right, racializing or choosing race groups to limit and manage access to labor. So the Harrison Narcotics Acts, there were 3 of them in the early part of the 20th century, were the most wide-sweeping legislation around drugs, and they saw actually their main purpose was to manage the economic and para-economic functions of narcotics and exert control over the population through narcotics legislation. So the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, the first one, regulated the distribution of opium and gave sole control of it to doctors and made it taxable. The second one in 1924 made the importation of opiates illegal, and it was expanded again in 1937 to include marijuana under its auspices. In each instance, these laws were enacted to control labor, first to prevent Chinese immigrants from working on the railroad, and later to criminalize Mexican immigrants who were working in farm jobs. And the 1937 Act had major implications for the Great Migration and Black people moving north to work in factories as part of it, especially as it ended up criminalizing a lot of Black artists, and particularly jazz musicians, who were often arrested under these new Harrison narcotics laws. So given the centrality of criminalization to the US's national drug strategy, it is not at all surprising that not only the earliest, but the longest running research on addiction was conducted at a prison. The Lexington Federal Narcotics Hospital and Prison, which was also known as NARCO, was in Lexington, Kentucky. It was there that doctors and researchers used totally unethical, non-consensual experiments on prisoners to develop the first quantitative scales for measuring addiction and for establishing the now common understanding of addiction as a chronic and relapsing disease. Currently, prisons are our largest addiction treatment centers, and national discourse continues to demonize addicts. There are some alternative models. Public health and social health models of health tend to emphasize empathy and harm reduction, but medical models, and these are kind of the ones that are most beholden to insurance companies and the ones to which we have the most access, continue to emphasize personal responsibility and the moral failing of the addict. This idea, right, that the addict is somehow a bad person, a moral failure. This is kind of part of our contemporary and popular notion of addicts. Despite medical research into addiction, the term itself is often contested and considered ill-defined in medical literature. So much so that for the majority of its existence, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Illnesses, left out the term addiction, period, until the 2013 revamp, that is the DSM-5. And then when addiction entered into the diagnostic lexicon, it was joined by the equally nebulous term behavioral addictions, which indicates addictions that are non-chemical, such as gambling addictions. Kind of expands the field of what counts as an addiction. Today, addictions still remain nebulous in meaning. In addition to the idea of addiction as dependence, chemical or otherwise, there's also a positive sense, right? Game makers, for example, will market their video game as addictive, or we'll call our favorite TV show addictive, meaning that it's engrossing and exciting. We can't wait to watch more or play more, right? There, however, tends nevertheless to remain this moralizing attitude towards this former kind of addiction, right? Addictions that disrupt social functioning. Hopefully, throughout the course of this class, we'll put some pressure on these ideas and concepts. But it is this distinction among good and bad types of addiction that brings me back to this question of art, and especially art in its current sense. So here I'm going to kind of reach back to that distinction I talked about earlier between mastering the art of intoxication on the one hand and being mastered by the intoxicant or addicted on the other. This distinction is really interesting because many of the philosophers, theorists, and thinkers that we're going to engage with have a relatively positive, even transcendent view of intoxication insofar as you are not intoxicated by substances. Instead is the insubstantial, right? The non-substance, the immaterial, language, creativity, thought that one should be intoxicated by. As we're reading for the first class, for Plato by way of Derrida, language is the ultimate pharmacon or drug with the double power to both poison or cure. And the writer, or later the artist, or what we might think of as the pharmacus, right, is the physician or pharmacist, the one who dispenses the drug. For Nietzsche, to be intoxicated by drugs or alcohol is to be dulled from access to the truth. But to be intoxicated by thought and writing is to get closer to it. For Helene Cixous, the famous French feminist theorist, écriture féminine, her most famous concept, which is women's writing or feminine writing, is positively intoxicated writing. Writing that is both written as though intoxicated by the very act of writing, but which is also intoxicating to read, but it bears no relationship to chemical intoxication. Even William Burroughs, who is the most famous addict in US history, who spent almost all of his waking hours intoxicated, spent his whole life looking for the kick, that is a high or intoxicated state, by, quote, other than chemical means, end quote. For him, this ultimately means that he abandons language, which he sees as a form of controlling addiction, the addiction to language, right? And he instead moves to painting, film, and other forms of visual art for the last years of his life. For all of these thinkers and writers, art itself can be an intoxicating substance with the power to poison or cure. And addiction to these non-chemical artistic forms of intoxication may itself be curative or the very cause of our death. It's not until the 17th and 18th centuries that art takes on its current meaning. Plastic arts, performance, music, relationships to the aesthetic, aesthesis, the sensory perception, affects, the affective perception of experience, rather than skill and craft, right? This distinction between the aesthetic and skill and craft doesn't come around until the 17th and 18th centuries. It's precisely around this turn to aesthetics that we'll approach art in this course. We'll ask some questions about what art is and how it not only relates to intoxication and addiction, but what it can tell us about intoxication and addiction. We'll try to figure out what intoxicated art is or does. Is it mimetic? That is it a kind of mirror? Does it represent intoxicated and addicted states? Is it didactic? Does it try to give us lessons, moral or otherwise, about intoxication and addiction and how we should think about them or experience them? Or is it perhaps expressive, literally pressing out, express, right? To press out of the body. Is it expressive of something about intoxication and addiction for these artists, writers, thinkers, musicians? Or I think most interesting to me, is it experiential? Is art a mode of intoxicated experience? And if so, what would that mean? So these are all some different questions that we'll kind of approach through class. And we'll always approach them in a mix of historically, scientifically, socially informed ways, but we'll really try to focus on what the aesthetic brings us. What does art bring us in relationship to these questions? So I'll leave us off there, and I'll look forward to seeing you real soon.